Good evening, everyone. I'm Michael Taylor. I'm the Chief Curator and Deputy Director for Art and Education here at VMFA, and it gives me immense pleasure to welcome you to tonight's lecture. My job, which is I'm honored to do, is to introduce Chris Oliver, who is the Bev Perdue Jennings Assistant Curator of American Art and the curator of this fabulous Ansel Adams show. It's on view until January 2nd, so if you haven't seen it, you have plenty of time to see it. And if you have seen it, go see it again. It's filled with discoveries and wonders. So Chris is a remarkable curator. Not only did he do Ansel Adams, but he also did the Natural Bridge. It was Virginia Arcadia, the Natural Bridge in American Art. It was an exhibition of a beloved Virginia landmark and had 62,000 visitors during a pandemic. How great is that? So with me, you always get the inside of baseball. So this Ansel Adams show was meant to have been on last year, but something happened in March of 2020 that closed this museum. And we felt really bad because we had on view, it had just opened, a show on the accompanying workshop. And we decided that when we reopened at the end of June of 2020, we would keep accompanying up. And it bumped Ansel Adams. So Chris didn't miss a beat. I said to him, would you be okay with doing back-to-back shows, Virginia Arcadia, the Natural Bridge in American Art, and Ansel Adams? And he said, absolutely, it would be a pleasure. And of course, I think what you have to remember is exhibitions are all-consuming. And I know because I'm about to open a Man Ray show, you get to do press, tours, the installation, everything is coming at you at once. And Chris is just very calm, like a swan gliding across the lake. So with that, I would like Chris Oliver to come up to the stage and introduce tonight's illustrious speaker.
Thank you, Michael, for that very generous introduction. And thanks to each of you for joining us tonight for this talk. I know it's been highly anticipated, something that we have had on the program, albeit moved for quite some time. So tonight's program is Ansel Adams Up Close and Personal with Andrea Grace Stillman, and it's my distinct honor to introduce her to the capacity crowd here in the Cheek Theater, as well as the hundreds more who are streaming live online at home right now. Andrea Grace Stillman is an acknowledged expert on the life and work of Ansel Adams. In addition to her degree from Barnard College, her work in the Prints, Drawings, and Photographs Department of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and then later as the Director of Development at the Morgan Library, Andrea had a close relationship with the artist, having worked for several years for him in the 1970s. And that's a story that I think she'll expand upon tonight. But after her work with Adams, her involvement with him absolutely did not end. She has been a prolific author, editor, curator, and all-around art historian dealing with the life and work of Adams. From just a few amongst a plentiful number of publications is Ansel Adams Letters and Images from 1988, Ansel Adams Our National Parks from 1992, Ansel Adams 400 Photographs from 2007, and from most recently, 2012, Looking at Ansel Adams, the Photographer and the Man. So that's a lot of what I think we'll hear about this evening. But before I do ask Andrea to come to the stage, I need to thank her specifically for this exhibition would not be possible without her. Those of you who have seen the exhibition may have noticed her name literally all over the walls. Over the course of the past 5 years, Andrea has donated 21 photographs by Ansel Adams to the museum's permanent collection, a generous and changing gift. And so that is something that I really want to thank you for. So with that little preview of applause, would you please join me in welcoming Andrea Gray Stillman?
Okay, can these old eyes see the, oh, I can. God, I've got a really great light here. Okay, first I need to make some thank you comments. First, thank you, Chris Oliver. I'm always going to think of you as a swan gliding across. And thank you, Michael Taylor. And thank you, Lou Laniu. And thank you, Chris Burford. You all know what you've done for tonight, and I really appreciate it. And then I also have to thank my friend Denise Bethel. Where are you sitting, Denise? Well, I can't see your hand waving, but it's because of Denise that I am having this relationship with the museum. Not that I didn't already, because I love the museum and I lived here in the 1990s, or maybe it was, yeah, in the 1990s. And because my sister and her husband, Bob Burris, have been, practically living here at certain times in their lives. So I have a long relationship. But I live in Napa, California, and the fires and the smoke have gotten worse and worse. I've lived there for 4 years now, and I don't know how much longer I'm going to be able to stay, given what it's like there. And I thought, I've got these Ansel Adams photographs in this box underneath my bed, and I don't think this is safe, because if we have a fire, I mean, it's a lot of things to remember. You got to take the dog to race to the car, and you got to have your passport and several $100s in cash, and you got to make sure you have gas in the car. And it's a lot of things to remember at one time. You might forget the box that's under the bed. And so I thought, I don't think it's safe to have them here, so I'm going to give them away. Now, who am I going to give them to? And I thought of the Museum of Modern Art, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Morgan Library, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and then I thought, wait a minute, I better talk to Denise. And I said, Denise, where do you think these photographs should go? She said, well, what about the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts? And I said, well, I didn't know that they were particularly interested in photography. She said, oh, yes, I am going through their collection. You'd be surprised. They have been buying for years, and they have some wonderful treasures, and they're going to get a curator and the whole 9 yards and a new space. And I said, oh, well, that's a really good idea. And so she put me in charge with Chris. And of course, when you have the opportunity to work with a swan gliding across the river, it just gets better and better. So I said, I'm just going to send them all to you. And then I found one more after I sent the first ones. I found one more, and I said, it's the little monolith, and the little tiny monolith in the first gallery. And I said, I'm sending that in honor of Denise, because she really is a force of nature in the world of photography. She headed the photography department at Sotheby's for longer than we want to think about, because she doesn't want to think about her age. And she really put photography on the map. And so thank you, Denise, for all you've done. I don't think you get enough kudos. So that's enough. I don't know. That's enough about me. Anyway, I think the photographs are very well happy here. My son visited me recently. He said, he's 32. He said, well, Mom, where are your Ansel Adams photographs? I said, well, there are 5 on the wall here in my library. I've never hung any of them before, but I finally am living in a place in Napa with a wonderful red library, and just like the dark walls here, the black and white photographs pop off the color. And I said, well, I gave them away. Mom, why did you do that? I said, well, because they belong in a public institution, not on your wall. Well, Mom, I said, you'll inherit the 5 photographs that are on my walls now, and that's just absolutely, you can split with your sister, that's plenty. So you have to be careful what you do with your kids. But, it's mine to do whatever I want with. And the photographs that I gave away, some were gifts from Ansel, some I bought from other dealers. My father and my grandfather died and left me enough money that I could kind of dabble a little bit in photography. And sometimes when I went to visit old friends of Ansel's, and at a certain point I wanted to interview all the people that had known him when he was young. But for instance, when he was actually playing the piano, or when he was hiking in the Sierra. And so I found their names. Virginia Adams helped me look everybody up in the phone book. This is the Dark Ages. This is 1980. And then I'd call up and say, hi, could I come and interview you? And they were thrilled. And then when I got there, they'd say, well, I've got these 2 old pictures from Ansel, and there's one hanging inside the front door. I'll never forget this man. I don't remember his name. And he said, it's a picture. Oh, is it upstairs? It may be upstairs in the gallery, but his copy of it it's a lake in the High Sierra from about 1923, and his copy was extra big for the period, this big. It was hanging right inside his front door when you walked in, and it was startling because it was printed on paper that looked like a bath mat. And I said, oh, that's the most incredible print I've ever seen. He said, really? He said, you know, I was holding Ansel's ass when I stood there. And I said, well, he cued me to laugh. He was holding Ansel, the lead on Ansel's donkey because they were out on a trek in the High Sierra. And this was his idea of humor for me. Anyway, I don't know what happened to that picture. I think it subsequently came up at auction. Denise probably remembers it. Anyway, so my life has been, there have been a lot of laughs in my life. So if you're going to talk about Ansel, you have to start with Yosemite, because the majority of his 45,000 negatives were made in Yosemite. And he said, the Sierra, the great earth gesture of the Sierra has colored and modulated my life. And it has colored and modulated my life too, just because of Ansel. And if anybody that visits Yosemite, I'm sure will feel exactly the same way. So how many people here have been to the Sierra Nevada? Oh, lots of people. How many people have been to Yosemite? Oh, well, all the rest of you better get with the program here. It is something you want to see before you die. Just like my sister says, Andrea, you've got to go see the Acropolis, you've got to go see Yosemite. So Ansel was born in 1902 in San Francisco. Oh, so this is one of my favorite pictures. And it's this glorious valley view with El Capitan on the left. You see Half Dome way down in the distance, and then the Three Graces are on your right. And you can't see the waterfall. You can see the ghost of Bridal Veil Fall on the right. All things that Ansel photographed over and over and over. They're like a leitmotif in his life. And this, to me, this is what it looks like right after it's snowed and the sky is cleared. Everything's just encrusted with snow. And in short order, when the sun comes out, it melts very fast. So if you're going to photograph snow in Yosemite, as Ansel said, you've got to get up really early in the morning. And Ansel, as serious as an artist as he was, and as he thought photography was an art and it needed to be nurtured and respected, his friends at the Hills Brothers Coffee Company in San Francisco called him up about 1960 and said, Ansel, we got a great idea. We want to put one of your pictures around one of our coffee cans, the big kind. And Ansel, what picture would you recommend? He said, oh, how about, it was going to come out at Christmas time. This is going to be a Christmas gift. So I've got a coffee can that has this picture wrapped around it, and I think I keep my Nespresso capsules in it. But I asked, maybe I'll give it to you for the collection. I don't need it in my kitchen cupboard forever. Anyway, I wanted you to see, Ansel has a sense of humor. He was serious, and it was a serious artistic pursuit, but he was not above having something made into a coffee can. So, and working for him was really fun, is all I can say. I was really lucky. So this is what Ansel looked like in the 1920s. He was born in 1902, so he was always 2 years younger than the year. And this is the worst mustache. And in this picture, he doesn't have his beard. He had what was called a weak chin, and it has kind of like a dimple thing in it. And so he was always trying to cover it up. Also, I think it was probably a chore to shave when you were in the High Sierra. So I only knew him with a beard, sometimes long, sometimes short. And he has very large ears. They particularly show in this picture. And he almost always wore a hat, usually in older age. When I knew him, I met him in 1970, so by then he was already wearing a Stetson all the time. But earlier he would wear other headgear. But you needed a hat in the Sierra because of the sun. So his first trip to Yosemite was in 1916 when he was 14 years old. And it was a vacation with his two elderly parents. He was an only child. They doted on him. If he sneezed, they put him in bed and made him stay in his room for a week because he might be coming down with pneumonia. I felt so sorry for him. Every letter from his mother talked about his health. It's a miracle he wasn't a terrible hypochondriac. So they're going on this vacation, and they buy him his first camera. It's a box Brownie. Up until then, he'd been using, I think, a 5x7 camera of some type that his father had, and he even took some photographs of some downtown San Francisco using the family camera. But this was his very own camera. And a box Brownie at this point, you took the film out and you sent it off to be, at this point I think you still went to Kodak, but shortly thereafter then it was developed by a man in San Francisco. So there was no darkroom work. And he was too young anyway, he didn't have a darkroom. He was 14 years old. So at this age, what was Ansel like? Well, he was what he admitted was a hyperactive child. He could not sit still. They asked him to leave grade school because he was unteachable. I mean, sure, he must have been cutting up he was making jokes, and he was the live wire. The teacher was probably, they actually said to his father, you have to take him out of school. So his father got a tutor for him, and at one point the tutor was heavily into religion, and Ansel and his family were, as far as I could see, absolute atheists. God felt nature was God, and vice versa. And so the Greek tutor said to him, Ansel asked the Greek tutor, well, if there is no God, if there is no, what is it? He said, how come if the world was created in 7 days, how come there are fossils in the rocks? And the tutor said, God put them there to test our faith. And Ansel remembered that from whatever age this was, 10 or 12. He was still telling the story when I met him and he was 72, which just shows, I don't think he ever went to church. This is very interesting. Okay, so they go to Yosemite and he's got his first camera. So he wants to take pictures. And this is one of his pictures. This is Half Dome. Do you see a clear picture of Half Dome there? No, it's got the trees right in front of it. So he was making a visual diary. This is the first page of his scrapbook. When he got home, his father pasted the photographs, these are little tiny box brownie, so they're all square, in this album, black paper that we all know conservationists hate because it's very acid. And Ansel's handwriting was atrocious. I could read it, but boy, it was a real challenge. And so his father wrote all the titles of all the things they saw. And the scrapbook included a lot of pictures of family because Ansel was making a diary, a visual diary of where he'd been. He was not making art. And all of us can I do the same thing. I make a visual diary. And in fact, after I'd worked for Ansel for about 6 years, I suddenly realized, why didn't I take advantage of this and really learn something about taking a serious photograph with a camera? You've got to set things as opposed to an Instamatic, Nikon Instamatic. And I said, Ansel, do you think I should buy a real camera? And he said, dear, for your purposes, your Nikon Instamatic is perfect. Because he'd seen my pictures, everybody's smiling and looking at you. And that's all I was interested in. And so he started out making a visual diary too. But in short order, he figured out there's more to this than just a visual diary. So this is a photograph. This is called Vogelsang Peak. He made this when he was 15 years old. Now it's pretty soft and fuzzy. It's printed on textured paper, so it doesn't look anything like the Ansel Adams photographs we know, and it's very small. It's probably like about this big. But he has a way with composition. I mean, the way he isolates the trees on the right. And anyway, it's an early work. And then this is Mount Florence through the trees. This he took when he was 21 years old. Now, if he were looking at this photograph today, he would say there's visual confusion between the branch and the peaks, and he should have dropped the camera or somehow moved the tripod. Ansel was a bear about clean definition. And this picture, is this really about the branch or about these peaks? It's not very interesting. But you have to remember that back then, there were no textbooks on photography, so Ansel learned by trial and error. And tips from people in San Francisco, like literally the photo finisher who he took his box brownie to develop the film. And he finally got a darkroom kind of set up in his bathroom, which means you had to pull the shade down and hope that there wasn't a light leak. This was still amateur night at the Follies, you know. Now, surprisingly, given his age, his knowledge of art, he did go to the Panama Pacific Art Exhibition, but he was more interested in the farm equipment than he was in the art that was there. And his technical abilities, a few of his negatives are almost modern, like this one. I just love, where'd the back of Half Dome go? Whoops. Oh, here, okay, well, this is this ridge in the Sierra. I love this. I think this looks like a work of modern art. I mean, it looks like Ansel Adams at 60. And this back of Half Dome, I think, is positively, bizarrely modern. You can't even see any information in this shadowy area. And if you're making a portrait of Half Dome, ordinarily everybody's doing it from the front. And of course, he was climbing all over it and around it, so he could approach it from many different angles. But I love this photograph too. So this back of Half Dome was when he was 18 years old. Then by the time he gets to be, this is 19 years old. This is up in the High Sierra. And this is in the gallery upstairs with a little tiny, it's a 3 1/4, 4 1/4, or 2 1/4, 4 1/4, okay, it's one of those little tiny glass plate like this. And so it's a contact print. And when I retired from him, he knew I really loved this picture. It should have gone to his archive. So maybe that's where it has to go. It's upstairs. I loaned it to the exhibition. I couldn't part with it yet because he inscribed it to me in the back, and he knew I just loved this photograph because I think it's very tender. So he used a soft focus lens, which produced what he called a flare of shimmering light. And even though he didn't believe in gimmicks, he nevertheless continued to include this image in all his books and in exhibitions for the rest of his life. And it was the only soft focus picture that he took that he ever brought forward with all his mature works. So obviously it resonated with him. Well, it resonates with me. It's in the Tuolumne Meadows, and how could you not love this? In the exhibition upstairs, this contact print is next to a print that he made about 1979. So it's much bigger. Instead of like this, it's like this, and it's much darker. So he kept printing this little negative. He kept printing. The other negatives, no, they were not printed. They were just left in the drawers. But this one he kept printing. Now, by the end of the 1920s, Ansel was making some really gorgeous photographs. This is from 1927. It's called Monolith, the Face of Half Dome. Ansel considered this photograph a breakthrough because it was his first visualization, not pre-visualization, as many people say. It's a visualization, meaning when he stood there with the camera set up on the tripod, on the little lip, looking up at Half Dome from an oblique angle, so it's not head-on, it's from an oblique angle, he was awed by, it was the majesty of nature, and he was trying to tell you what now, for starters, they had to hike in heavy snow all day to get to the spot. So, but he knew he wanted to take this picture. He had this in mind. So they get up there, and he decides if he just clicks the shutter, it's not going to translate for you, the viewer, to tell you what he's feeling at the moment that he's standing there. So he puts on a filter that makes the sky dark. If you looked at he took two negatives. First, he did it with just the sky white. Next, he put the filter on and the sky is dark. And it changes the nature of it, makes the face of the rock darker too. So what he says about Yosemite, the rocks in Yosemite, he says they are the very heart of the earth speaking to us, and we should not casually pass them by. And I agree with him about that. So this all his life, he included this in many, many exhibitions, and he made many, many prints. Up in the gallery, there's a print from 1927, the same year he made the negative, and it's about like this, and it's printed on textured paper, so it's kind of off-white. And then next to it is a big 16 by 20 glossy picture. So it's interesting to compare the changes. I want to show you a few more pictures from this early period. This is Bridal Veil Fall. It is very tough to get falling water to look like this in a photograph, let me tell you. But Ansel did this all the time. Now, if you go to Yosemite, I think you want to go in the early spring, not too late because there'll be too many people, and not too early because the waterfalls aren't running. Well, maybe they'll have some rain and they'll have waterfalls again. Because the waterfalls are glorious. The snow melts during the day when the sun's out on the High Sierra up here. And then it starts to run off. And by evening, you've got this massive volume of water coming down these waterfalls, and it's pounding on the floor. You can hear it all over the valley. It actually shakes the valley floor, this terrific noise. Ansel's wife, Virginia, her father was a terrible landscape painter. Ansel would never let a single one of his paintings be hung in their house. The minute he died, let me tell you, those paintings came out of the closet, and they were all over the house. And they were just awful daubs. But anyway, her father, because he had a studio in Yosemite, she spent her summers there with him while he was painting. And so her parents had gotten married at the foot of Bridal Veil Fall. And the San Francisco Chronicle published a little quote that they got married there, and it said that the people that attended the wedding couldn't understand or hear a word that was being spoken by the bridal couple because of the force and volume of the water. So this is about 1930. So by 1930, Ansel was 28 years old. He'd married Virginia in 1928, and he'd become a very accomplished photographer. This is what he looked like then. Now, this is taken on a pack trip in the High Sierra in the 1930s, with the wind ruffling his hair. You can see the hair on the top of his head is getting a little scant. And when I met him when he was 72, there was almost nothing there. There was kind of a fringe around the back. On the other hand, he had always had a beard, so there was some hair around. But I guess you could say this lack of hair went with his lack of teeth. Just as he was about to marry Virginia in 1928, he had yet another appointment with the dentist where the dentist said, "I could retire on you, but really, I hate to do this to you. You'd have to spend your entire life in my chair. Why don't you just have all your teeth removed?" Now, he's just about to get married. This is not when you have your teeth removed. He had all his teeth removed, which then you have to wait to get the false teeth, right? And then, but he did this because the dentist said it's just going to be a lot of pain, agony, and money. So Ansel carefully put his teeth in a glass of water every night with a cleaner, and he didn't ever want me or anybody else to see him without his, because you know your mouth kind of doesn't look so great. However, even though he didn't have his teeth, he always had a great beard. And here is kind of not much of a beard, but later on it gets very big. There were always arguments between Virginia and Ansel's biographer, Nancy Newhall, who was also his best friend and secretly in love with him, over what length the beard should be. I think it's rather like your dog. Who gets to decide whether your dog has short-haired or long-haired? Now, in 1932, Ansel joined with some other Bay Area photographers, most famously Edward Weston and Imogen Cunningham, and they founded something called Group F64. That refers to the stop on the camera that gives sharp focus and really good depth of field. They wanted to depart from soft focus photographs that looked more like charcoal drawings than photographs. And when you look at the very early photographs by Ansel up there from the 1920s, in a way you can't tell whether they're photographs. They could be etchings, they could be what exactly are these? And they wanted to make sure you knew it was a photograph. And furthermore, they wanted the pictures to be very crisp and glossy images, and they wanted you to photograph everyday objects with a minimum of fuss. Well, that doesn't mean striding the High Sierra. That means staying at home. So Ansel was walking along in San Francisco one day, and what he was drawn to for this picture was the contrast between the shiny ivy leaves and the rough texture of the wood. Now, you could walk by this and miss it, right? But it caught Ansel's attention. So, and this reminds me that Alan Ross, Ansel's assistant when I was working for him, went out with Ansel to make Polaroid. At a certain point for Portfolio 7, every portfolio included an original Polaroid. So Ansel actually had to go out in the car with Alan, and they'd go driving around looking for something to make a little Polaroid this big. And Alan was busy driving the car, but he said all of a sudden Alan would see nothing in view that you thought would make a good photograph. Ansel would say, "Oh, stop, put the brakes on, get out." Ansel has found something that makes a really marvelous photograph. He had this talent for seeing these things. And in fact, he said that no matter where he was, if he was sitting in the afternoon at home being interviewed by a reporter or critiquing somebody's portfolio, he was making photographs all the time. If he were here looking at you, he'd be making photographs. It was just his natural tendency. Anyway, with Group S64, he started making some interesting photographs like this. Like this one. This is, again, another found object. He was walking across a bridge on the Mills College campus, and he looked down the little bridge, and here was this wonderful foliage underneath, and he just pointed his camera down. He didn't change anything. He didn't move a branch. He didn't add or subtract. He just rotated his camera until he got what he thought was the right combination. And there it is. It's a found object. Now, what's interesting is the negative measured 8 by 10, and of course he made a contact print, an 8 by 10 contact print right then. But almost immediately thereafter, he also printed this image on giant, giant sheets of photographic paper, like this, 3. And then he had it made into a screen. So it's a 3-part screen. And it's very hard to do this because you have to get the image to look like it's joining right at where the hinge is in the screen. And the screen stood in his living room all his life, and now his son and daughter-in-law have inherited the house. This is his retirement home in Carmel, overlooking the Pacific, and the screen is still there. And what you ask yourself is, how can an 8 by 10 negative look good blown up to, I don't know, 10 feet by 12 feet? It's because Ansel could get so much information in the negative, and he always said, I can work magic in the darkroom with light and dark, but if that information is not there in the negative, I can't create it. So he also talked about this relating to music, that there are 88 keys on the piano, and you should be able to play all 88 keys when you're playing the piano. With photography, it goes from white to black. You should be able to play every tone from white to black, and that's what makes an interesting photograph. Anyway, so Ansel's mentor, Alfred Stieglitz, at one point wrote a letter to Ansel and said, I believe the quality of tenderness is an important part of every photograph. And I consider this an example of tenderness. And but that's not necessarily a word that most people would use to describe Ansel's work. They'd say heroic, bombastic, I don't know, unbelievable. That they certainly wouldn't say tender, but there are these tender moments, and you'll see some up in the show too. Now, when Ansel showed this photograph, an 8 by 10, to the director of the Yale University Art Gallery Art Department in 1933, the man kept saying, but just what is this? Is this an etching? Is it a lithograph? Or is it a detail of a painting? He was absolutely incredulous that this was a photograph of nature, which shows just how well he had a long way to go in understanding photography. So he was so impressed with Ansel that he gave him a show. The next year, it was one of Ansel's earliest shows, 1933. Now this stump, I've often wondered about the actual size of this stump. In the 1930s, Ansel printed this negative very small, 5 by 7 inches, because it was a contact print from the negative. But when he was in his 70s, he switched to paper that was 16 by 20 inches, great big, and then the stump fills the whole sheet of paper. And at first, I didn't like it until I saw a little vintage print that he'd given to one of his assistants before me, a contact print. And what you're aware of is the very careful way Ansel has framed this. Look at this tight cropping. What makes this photograph not just a boring stump, but a work of art is this little tiny careful edge around, the way he's framed it. And it's just so beautiful. And now I actually like the big ones too. Sometimes these come up at sale and nobody at auctions, and they're not very popular. But I think people are missing a good bet. And he was very careful about the edges of photographs too. When people came and showed him their portfolios, and anybody could call up and make an appointment for 5 p.m. when he knocked off work, and he would invite them into his home for a drink, and they'd spread their photographs out and talk to him about those. And Ansel was always very careful to discuss edges and cropping with them, because it was a pet peeve of his that people didn't pay attention to the edges. And the drama of this rests on the fact that the stump is trying to break out of the frame. Ansel made this picture, so this is another 8 by 10 negative, but when I saw it first, it was lying on his, when I first started working for him, he was finishing portfolio 7, and this was in portfolio 7. And it was a great big 16 by 20 prints, and I didn't know very much, so I had the temerity to say, well, Ansel, I don't like that photograph very well. Oh, God. People didn't usually tell Ansel things like that. And so, and he said, well, why you don't like this? Look, this is a very important photograph. Look, he said, I got the glint on the milk bottle. I got this is just stuff from the kitchen. So this is an F-64 thing. You just stuff around the house, you assemble it. That's the top of the coffee filter there. And then he says, look, the tines, you know, these egg cutters, the tines are just about the cut. There's this, it's very almost scary. It's about to cut through the egg white. And he said, I accomplished all these things. And I said, well, I don't know, Ansel. I'm just not sure. It's just not my favorite photograph. And sure enough, when this comes up for auction, it doesn't go for very much money. But what resonates with me is the conversation that I had with Ansel, that he was this was a way of, in a way, he's learning how to do these things. So he's setting himself a goal. Now, I don't want you to think that the 1930s were just a technical workshop, because Ansel could also make ravishing photographs of the landscape, like this. This is upstairs, Frozen Lake and Cliffs, 1932. This was taken on one of the Sierra Club high trips when more than 100 people go on a fancy hike out in the Sierra Nevada. The scene is a frozen lake in the Cahuilla Gap in the southern Sierra, and Ansel wrote that he was impressed with the solemn beauty of the scene. And he says he saw the image quite clearly in his mind. Now, when the other hikers on the Sierra Club trip saw where Ansel had set up his tripod, many of them had brought their cameras along. They would go out for 3 to 6 weeks, and they'd go 10 or 15 miles a day. They would rush over with their tripods and set them up next to his. They were sure that if Ansel was taking a picture, it's got to be something worth, and that they'd go over there. Well, they didn't see what he saw. So his friend Cedric Wright was along. He took a photograph at the same time. He didn't see Ansel's photograph for a few years, and in Ansel's archive, there's a letter that Cedric wrote to Ansel, and he said, Jesus, why didn't I see that? Because Ansel has isolated this little tiny bit of this frozen lake with a glacier and the rocks behind it. And why didn't I see that? It's a good question. Now, Virginia said that she took a dip in the water here after they finished photographing. It must have been very cold. And in fact, there's a wonderful picture of her and her friend lying on a rock in their bathing suits. They're kind of posing. Anyway. This is another photograph from the 30s, 1939. Merced River, cliffs of Cathedral rocks in autumn. And this photograph, you think that Ansel's out in the wilderness all the time in inaccessible spots. Actually, this is the bridge that you drive across in Yosemite to cross the river. But Ansel sets up there, and he captures every little detail. I love the hot light on the sunlight on the left. The detail of the rocks, every little leaf. And again, this is where he says you have to be able to capture all of this in order to make a good photograph. And then you can print it as big as you want. So in my library, I have one of this at 16 by 20 inches. And why I like it is I can walk right up to it and stand in front of it. I can think I'm in Yosemite, because you could swear you're there. This is from 1937. Aspens, Dawn, Autumn, Dolores River Canyon in Colorado, so we're not in the Sierra anymore. For Ansel, the most important exhibition of his life was the show that Alfred Stieglitz gave at his New York gallery in American Place in 1936. And in 1974, standing in his one-man show at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, that's when I met him because I worked on the show, he turned to me and he said that nothing could compare with the show at Stieglitz's gallery, even this show at the Met. And I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. I was just absolutely flabbergasted. And after that show, Ansel went on a trip to southern Colorado, and he made this photograph, and he wrote to Stieglitz, I think I am getting some very good things, quite different, I believe. I like to think of my present stuff as more subtle, more lifting up the lid, if you know what I mean. Now, John Sarkoski, the distinguished curator of photographs at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, who's now dead, he described this picture as a fugue of aspens. It is very, very sober and quiet, and these are not words that would usually be applied to an Ansel Adams photograph. This is one of my favorite photographs. It's so pure and so still. Now, Chris Oliver had the great idea to pipe into the show a tape of Ansel playing the piano, because he thought at first he was going to be a concert pianist. And so in 1945, he went to a studio in New York and recorded a Bach prelude, a first movement of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, and a Scriabin prelude. Is it an etude or a prelude? They're very simple. I actually can play all three, which tells you they're very simple to play. And you'll hear them upstairs. But what Ansel was known for when his piano playing reminds me of the purity of this picture, because he was trained very fiercely by Marie Butler, who was his first piano teacher. And for the first 6 weeks, he couldn't even play anything. He had to practice pressing the keys. This sounds so boring. I don't know how he persevered, but he had what was a great sense of legato. When I want to produce legato, I put that pedal down. Not Ansel, and even at age 43, when he was making the recordings that you hear upstairs, he could still produce a beautiful, beautiful legato tone. So to me, this is analogous to his love of music. Here's another 1930s picture. This is Mount Whitney from the west. For this picture, Ansel set out at 3 o'clock in the morning in the dark on a strenuous hike to a point where you can see the sun come up on Mount Whitney. And believe it or not, anywhere was to take a photograph, that otherwise he couldn't justify leaving home and work. So when we were in London, in Paris, and Ansel said at dinner, well, who wants to get up with me and go out? I want to photograph the flying buttresses of Notre Dame, where Ansel, Virginia, his wife, his granddaughter, Sylvia, me, and my husband at the time, Bill Turnage, his business manager. I am the only person that volunteers, and I'm thinking, are you crazy? Who would pass up photographing the flying buttresses at dawn with Ansel in Paris? So it was real dark. But then the sun comes up, and the only people out there are the street sweepers with the little twig brooms, you know, and Ansel set up his camera and tripod. And sure enough, a young man walks up and says, "Are you Ansel Adams?" I mean, it's dawn in Paris. And this must have been 1979. So it was obviously the camera, the tripod, and the Stetson hat. But I just thought, even here, they know who he is. So, and that reminds me that Ansel worked 7 days a week. Every day was another opportunity to make a perfect print or finish a writing project. And as I would leave on Friday night, he would say, "Oh, will I see you tomorrow, dear?" He never called me Andrea. I think he called all women dear. "Oh, will I see you tomorrow, dear?" And I would say, "No, well, it was Saturday. I'm going to be at home." And then the next morning, I would be digging in my garden. I had a little deck, and I was putting little plants in. And over the top of the little fence, this face would pop up with this big smile and this Stetson hat. And he'd say, "Oh," you said, "I was just passing by." Now, I lived on a dead-end street, which shows you Ansel just needed a little company. Anyway, now the next decade of Ansel's life, 1940 to 49, was the most intense period of his life because he could simply take pictures because of the national parks. This photograph was made in the 1940s, is very obviously posed, and Ansel really liked to pose. And look at this wonderful the way the chin comes with this beard, and he's not really setting anything. This is just for the camera. But now people think Ansel was rich and successful and sold hundreds of photographs, especially when they see the prices of his work these days. But it wasn't really until 1970 that he started selling prints, a lot of prints. So he supported himself and his family and his 2 children by doing commercial work: Fortune, Life magazine, Kodak. Anybody here ever see the Kodak Coloramas in Grand Central? Raise your hand. Did you ever? Oh, they're huge, huge color. You'd have a whole California field of poppies. It would be 30 feet long, transparency. Those were by Ansel, and Kodak paid a lot of money. And they paid extra if you got a rainbow in the picture. I'm not kidding. Really, he wrote about this in a letter to somebody. So in 1941, the Secretary of the Interior hired him to visit all the national parks and monuments in the United States. Bear in mind, there weren't as many as there are now. So, and the best would be blown up to be murals in the brand new Department of the Interior offices in downtown Washington. And they would pay Ansel a per diem. I checked, it was a modest $5 a day plus 4 cents a mile. And now this allowed him to stop doing commercial work for a few months and just travel and photograph. And furthermore, it allowed him to visit places he'd never been, like Alaska and the Pacific Northwest. So I want to show you some of the pictures he made during this period. This is the Tetons in the Snake River. It is really hard to photograph the Tetons. The sun's always in the wrong direction. The funny thing is, many of the photographs that he made on these trips were, he wasn't striding the High Sierra. It's in a car with all your equipment. You don't have the burro, and you haven't got an assistant with you. And so even though he's in the car and on the road, it still looks like we're out in nature, right? Wrong. I'm floating down the Snake River in a boat with my family. The guide is talking and has no idea I have any relationship to Ansel, and he declares at one bend in the river, it was right above us on the road, on the riverbank, that Ansel Adams made his photograph of the Tetons. And my kids start laughing, and they would say, Mom, go tell him who you are. I said, not a chance. So anyway, often it looks like the photographs are made in the wilderness, and they aren't. They're on the road, but he could see something special on the road. Then this is a series of, he spent a lot of time in Yellowstone, although he considered Yellowstone a very inferior park because they were just curios. For him, only the peaks in the Sierra were works of art. They were works of sculpture, and every place else didn't measure up. He did like the geysers, but that, and so he took a lot of wonderful photographs, the geysers, all different times of day. Again, it's pretty hard to photograph water like this, let me tell you. Sadly, after 2 months photographing, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. We declared war, and Ansel's job as a muralist was canceled. But he'd already made a number of photographs, and later on in the 40s, the Guggenheim Foundation gave him several, at least 2, if not 3, fellowships, so he could finish his project. Although he never got to a lot, he didn't get to a lot of places, and the murals were never made. It was just, it was a great idea that never happened. But on one of these trips, he got to Alaska, and he was on a trip with his son Michael. He never took his daughter Anne on any trips. It was just the son Michael, and they were given a ranger's cabin away from this mountain and they spent the night there in order to photograph. He wanted to photograph dawn, right? Well, dawn in Alaska is at 1:30 in the morning. So he set up his camera on his tripod on this hill, several miles away, using a telephoto lens. And oh, wait a minute, it's not Mount McKinley. It's Denali. Sorry, I'm not being politically correct. So Ansel set up his camera and tripod, and he went to sleep, and then he got up at 1:30 in the morning to catch the sunrise. And so he can remember telling me this many, many years later, 30 years later. He could describe how the mountain turned pink and then the entire sky became golden. Now, if you look at the distant shore in the lake, there's something that looks rather fuzzy. See down a little fuzzy patch? I asked Ansel what that was. He said, oh, that's the mosquitoes. The swarms of mosquitoes in Alaska were just incredible. So Alaska really inspired him. He went up an airplane and made aerial photographs with the door open and he's leaning out. He wrote, in Alaska, I felt the full force of vast space and wilderness. At that point, in comparison to Alaska, Yosemite seemed pretty small and heavily impacted by man. And Ansel successfully lobbied President Carter in 1979 and 80 to create the Alaska Lands Bill. I mean, he actually went to Washington and met Carter. Well, he took his official photograph, but he also, he agreed to take the photo because he wanted to go lobby Carter to create this special Alaska Lands Bill. So the 1940s were a very rich time for Ansel artistically. His technique was brilliant, and he felt free to photograph for the first time. If you look at the more of the photo pictures he made in the 1940s, you'll see Ansel's hallmark style, beautifully ordered compositions, a very precise way of seeing, spectacular light, and of course every rock and detail perfectly rendered. I think you can sense his excitement about the environment that he was photographing. Now this is White House Ruin Canyon, Deshay. His travels for the mural project also included the Southwest. And he made 2 different negatives of this image. Timothy O'Sullivan in the 19th century made a picture almost like this, but Ansel made 2 versions, one with this little piece of sky and the other without it, so it's head on, so there's a slight difference. And he felt that he had found Timothy O'Sullivan's tripod holes. Denise will tell you it's an icon of the history of photography, the Timothy O'Sullivan. And then this is Canyon Deshay from the rim. It's very hard to photograph something like this. Look at this giant landscape. And Ansel chooses to give you this little tiny sky at the top, which I think is just so marvelous. He just isolates this and lets you look down, but you also see these wonderful forms of this sandstone. When he was here, he went with, at one point, he went with Georgia O'Keeffe, and he had with him his Zeiss 35 millimeter camera that Zeiss had given to him. And he eschewed small cameras. He said they were really good for taking pictures of people. And O'Keeffe and Orville Cox, the guide, were standing on the lip looking down in that, what we just saw before. And Orville Cox was talking about something in the distance. And O'Keeffe, who flirted even at age 90 when I met her, she's turning around looking like, and maybe they were having an affair, it's true, who knows. And so Ansel took this photograph. And I have to say, when O'Keeffe visited Ansel and Carmel at the dinner table, she only paid attention to the men. Virginia and I were seated there. We didn't exist. She was, and she made us know that that she was probably having an affair with her 35-year-old assistant. He was divine, and and when you got O'Keeffe and Ansel together, she took us up to the Ghost Ranch where her studio was. And we get to we get out of the car. Ansel at this point is overweight. You know, he's having heart trouble. And we get out. O'Keeffe is wearing these little kind of fabric slippers. She races right over. There's one of those ladders that kind of aren't ladders. They're just kind of pieces of wood that go up, that they have in the Southwest. It goes up to the top of the adobe building. She scampers up it. She says, "Come on, Ansel." Well, what was he going to do? He couldn't get up that ladder. She never let him forget it. And they always bantered about age. We sitting at the dinner table, she'd say, "Ansel, I'll always be older than you." It was really funny to see the two of them because Ansel thought she was like a goddess, and she was a great painter. Now, this is one of the last great pictures from the 1940s. This is called Winter Sunrise, Sierra Nevada. And it was made on the east side of the Sierra. So you're looking west, and the whole Sierra's out. It's just beautifully laid out for you. Mount Whitney's far on the right, the highest peak on the right. He knew he wanted to take this picture because he drove by. He was working at he couldn't get it. He thought he should be in World War II because his friends were. Edward Weston was watching for submarines in Carmel, and Beaumont Newhall was doing aerial reconnaissance in Africa, and somebody else. Everybody was in the Army but him doing something. So he went to Manzanar Relocation Center right close to this, just a few miles away from this, and took photographs of the people there to try and get the message out about how the Japanese weren't all horrible. And he took wonderful photographs, upbeat, wonderful people. It looked happy, and he photographed it totally differently from Dorothea Lange, who'd been there 4 years earlier, and everybody looked like they were dying. So, but when I look at this photograph, I think I see an American flag hanging in the top there, because this is America. And if you think that this was when World War II was going on, he was very, very patriotic, Ansel. So he went out. He knew he wanted to take it at dawn. Well, dawn, you got to get up in the dark. So they get up in the cold and the dark at Manzanar Relocation Center. Virginia makes coffee. They get in the car. They drive over there. 5 mornings running, they went, and there were clouds. He knew he wanted a blank sky, white mountains, black hills, and the sun hitting the meadow in the foreground. So finally, on the 5th morning, he gets up there on the tripod, on the camera, on the platform on top of his car, and finally, it's a beautiful sun coming up, and he clicks the shutter. And many years later, he wrote, and this is often taken very badly by some people, "Sometimes I think I do get to places just when God's ready to have somebody click the shutter." I mean, this can seem a little pompous, but I do think there's an element of truth there, you know. And this is this photograph is when you first walk in the gallery. This part of this photograph is on the wall. See this roof rack? He had this installed in 1943. He was very proud of it. He used to sleep out on in a sleeping bag. because there weren't a lot of, where he was photographing Death Valley, you know, Glacier National Park, there were no motels. And he claimed it was very comfortable and he had a good night's sleep. And this Mount Williamson photograph, on again, the east side of the Sierra, he says, I set up my camera on the rooftop platform of my car, which enabled me to get a good view over the boulders to the base of the range. Well, the funny thing is that Ansel's assistants have returned to this exact spot where Ansel made this photograph. You can still find the rocks. And there are a whole lot of people, me included, who like to go back to the spot and see it in nature. I mean, so they said that they can't figure out what Ansel's talking about because he says these boulders that look huge here are actually very small. So I don't know. I always took everything Ansel said as gospel truth, but maybe not. This is a beautiful oak tree in snowstorm, of a glorious oak that used to be in Yosemite Valley. And it's long gone. For me, it just epitomizes fallen snow. And he did a whole series of trees. At one point, he did a portfolio of trees in Yosemite, but I think there were only like 3 copies made. That was in like 1936. Now, one of the last photographs we're going to look at is Moonrise. This is his most famous photograph. He was visiting O'Keefe up the valley, and he drove south on the highway, and he noticed the light, the setting sun illuminating the white crosses in the graveyard here. That's what attracted him, the white crosses standing out. And he says, I ditched the car. They got out, gets up on the platform, takes the picture. He said when he took the picture, he knew that he would print the sky dark. If you think that the sun's setting, the sky certainly was not this color. It was light gray or light dark blue. And so he knew ahead of it, as he's standing there, that he's going to change this. And over time, the sky has gotten blacker and blacker as he prints it. When the photography market heated up in the 1970s in New York, the New York Times wrote that you could chart the growth in the photography market by tracking the price of this image, Moonrise. It started out in 1974. We charged $350 for a print that measures 16 by 20 inches, like one hanging in the show upstairs. I know because I took the calls to people that ordered it. But now there weren't a lot, though. Let me tell you, it was still sparse. By 1980, when Ansel had long since stopped selling photographs completely, the price was already $13,000 to $15,000. Now the price for a Moonrise, like in the gallery, is routinely $30,000 to $50,000. Ansel never got any of this increase. The most he ever sold a Moonrise for was $350. And yesterday at lunch, the new curator of photographs here at the museum announced that a Moonrise, admittedly a giant, I don't know, 10 by 12 Moonrise, had sold for over $900,000 at auction. Ansel just wouldn't believe it, you know, so. This is me when I first went to work for Ansel. And he looks like he's flirting. He's not really flirting. He just was a real ham. You can see what fun he was. And see how the beard is much fuller now. And he's wearing these big glasses. He was just so much fun to be around. Going to work was just a treat. And the first photograph I really took seriously before I even met Ansel was Clearing Winter Storm. I remember standing in the gallery at the Metropolitan Museum thinking, I have never seen anything like, I have to go to this place. This is just incredible. Can you imagine standing here at this scene? And this was made in 1940, was it 41 or 44? Ansel said dates didn't matter. The only people that cared about dates were dry, old prunes. And anyway, he could care less about dates. Now, I want to show you, after about 1950, Ansel, for all intents and purposes, didn't photograph because he was old, fat, infirm, had a heart problem, and he couldn't stride the high Sierra, you know. And once we were looking at prints together, I said, well, Ansel, don't you miss being out in nature striding the high Sierra? You know, it sounds so romantic with your burro and sleeping on the granite and matrix and watching the stars come out at night and your little coffee can, you boil the coffee grounds up in there, it's a teetering. And he said, dear, he said, if I look at a photograph, I can remember the feeling of the wind in my hair, the dawn light. I can remember every technical detail of taking the photograph, the camera, lens, filter, f-stop, film time. I just don't need to do that anymore. I thought that was really very interesting. And he was happiest when he was either in the darkroom printing, at his typewriter, writing a technical book or a letter to a president and get them to do something, or he had a vault. His negatives were stored in a vault. They carved out in a big rock in his kind of little, right behind the office door outside his house. And there were sow bugs, there were spiders. I thought it was a nightmare. If I had to go out there, I did not look forward to it at all. And Ansel liked to perch out there on this really uncomfortable little stool like this, and he'd be going through the little negatives. He just was really happy as a clam. So I want to close with a series of pictures of Half Dome. First I want to show you the two great pictures he took from the 50s. In 1958, we're at the north rim of the Grand Canyon, Aspen. There's a big print of this upstairs. Now, actually, the sky at this point was kind of overcast and gray. It looks like night, but it's he's hopped it up in the darkroom. Oh, whoops. And then this vertical, which is even more gorgeous. It's so plain and quiet. And this was 1958, so he was 56 years old, so he was still capable of climbing out of the car and taking a great photograph. And this is just driving along the road. He and Beaumont and Nancy Newholland and a couple other friends are all out in the forest kind of photographing. Now, I want to show you a series of Half Dome. Ansel wrote, "I have photographed Half Dome innumerable times, but it is never the same Half Dome, never the same light or the same mood. And so I'm going to do this in alphabetical order, chronological order. This is 1916 from his scrapbook. This is 1932 with these wonderful, wonderful cottonwood trees in the foreground. This is like in the middle of about 1939. To me, this is not one of Ansel's great photographs. It just reeks of a postcard. And I love this from the side, from Glacier Point, where you see, you look up the Tenaya Canyon there with all of the clouds. And then back to Half Dome in his little book. And then this is the last photograph that he made, in a serious photograph that he made in Yosemite. He made it in 1960, so he was 58 years old. He said, "As soon as I saw the moon coming up by Half Dome, I had visualized the image." Now, to me, this picture is so modern. There are no clouds, no foliage, no foreground elements. It's just Ansel, the moon, and Half Dome. And so you think this is just such a neat package. He's reached a new plateau. He's stripped things away to their essence. And I could end the lecture right here. But then this modernist theory breaks down if I show you Ansel's last great picture made 8 years later in Yosemite. And here it is. It's El Capitan. And look at it. He was staying over for Christmas, and he woke up to find that he'd snowed. So he didn't have an assistant with him. So he drove to the spot where he'd photographed El Capitan countless times before. He slogs across a meadow in deep snow. He had a hard time setting up his tripod in the snow, getting it seated. He took this photograph that's reminiscent of his early work. Look at the fussy, snowy branches framing the picture on the left. It's kind of gorgeous, tamed chaos with a sense of poetry of light on the face of El Capitan. And I think this is one of his best photographs, and it's his latest great photograph. Now, what impresses me is at the age of 66, when Ansel hadn't made many creative photographs to speak of in years, he could still, on the spur of the moment, set up his camera in the bitter cold with no assistant to help his arthritic fingers attach the lens or put on the filter or apply the Polaroid back. He could do all this, and he could make a memorable photograph. Ansel lived another 16 years after he took this photograph, and he died in 1984. I think it was congestive heart failure, but really shortly before that, they'd opened him up and they found that he was riddled with cancer, and they just closed him up. I didn't get to see him then. Now, I gave a run-through of this lecture to a friend, and when I finished, she said, "You know, Andrea, I really miss knowing that Ansel is alive. He had such a sense of nobility." Now, she'd met Ansel several times. She even had lunch with him. She came out to visit me when I was living in Carmel, working for him. And I have to say that as glib and as, she said, he had such a sense of nobility, but then she also said that she felt she didn't really know him. He was unknowable. And I have to say that as glib and gregarious as Ansel was, he was essentially a very private man who communicated with us through his photographs. So Ansel's no longer alive, but to me, I still feel his presence when I look at his photographs. And not only do I feel his presence, but I feel his passion for America, for nature, for the future of the world as we know it. So he isn't really gone. We just have to look for him in his photographs. Thank you. Well, no, I talked way too long. I apologize. We were supposed to take some questions, but I won't be offended if you have to leave. Does anybody have any? He'll take color photographs, and I say, yes, he took thousands and thousands and thousands. And at one point, I went through his color transparencies. He had died by then. I went through his color transparencies, and unfortunately, there'd been terrible color shifts in some, but others were still glorious. Some of that early Kodak material was held up, and his sense of color was great. He always wore very colorful clothes. I thought maybe I should wear black and white tonight, and I thought, oh, Ansel would say, really, how dull. And he always had a bright shirt and a kind of a dark blue or turquoisey blue jacket, and he always wore a bolo tie. He never wore a regular tie. And after I stopped working for him at the end of his life, he painted the walls of his office, instead of being gray, Ansel Adams gray for the photograph, he painted them turquoise, and there was one kind of orange one, and I thought how he could be adventurous even at the end of his life. So I hope I showed you what fun he was, and what he was just a great human being. So, and people used to say, did you have an affair with him? I said, are you kidding? Well, he was 40 years older than I was, and he was a Victorian gentleman. He would have been, when he was in the darkroom, no one could bother him, but if the phone would ring and he could hear somebody picking up, and he could hear who it was. They were saying, oh, hello, I'm so sorry Ansel can't talk to you. And sometimes he'd pick up the phone, and then I'd put the phone down, and then if it was the right person, they'd tell him a dirty joke. And he'd come out of the darkroom later. Oh, his darkroom assistant was always a man, so they were guffawing over the door. And I'd say, well, what is so funny? Oh, we can't tell you. It's just not appropriate. Cracked me up. So, okay, well, thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the show.